Hello everyone and welcome back to Foundational JavaScript. This is video 2 in section 4, and today we're going to be covering functions in JavaScript. And the way that functions work under the hood in JavaScript is actually quite surprising. Here we have declared a function, and we're using the function keyword here to declare it. And then we are using the function name followed by a parenthetical with two pre-declared parameters. And you can obviously declare as many parameters for a function as you want. And then we use the return keyword to indicate what should be the return value from that function. And as we covered in the last lesson about objects, functions actually are objects secretly under the hood in JavaScript. It wouldn't be quite obvious when you're just writing it, but indeed, this is really just sort of an object that we're declaring that only has one method on it, and that can be instantiated using a syntax like add numbers and then the actual parameters for that function. So the only thing that's fancy about this object is that we have this syntax. And we can demonstrate that it's really an object by adding a property to it. As we covered last time, the syntax for adding properties to objects is just to add a dot and then the name of the property followed by the value we want to assign to that property. And if I go ahead and run index.js right now, we shall see that indeed we are able to return the property of this function, which is kind of strange in a way. And to make it even stranger, if we actually instead go ahead and check what type add numbers is, we'll see that it's actually a function. It's not an object. But really, secretly, it is a object masquerading as something else. But yeah, so the main thing we should take away from this is that this is the way to declare functions in JavaScript, and this is the way to return values. And I'm going to now show you the basic syntax for writing what is called an arrow function. Don't worry too much about what the difference is because we'll be covering that in the next video. But I could equivalently represent this function by doing this. I could go const add numbers equals num1, num2, and then the brackets, and then just return the same thing. And we'll see that this is pretty much equivalent, but there actually are some under the hood differences between the ways that normal functions and arrow functions work when executed. But essentially, we can think of this as just an alternative way to write functions, a different syntax for now. And then we can even more succinctly represent this function. This is a especially useful syntax if we're writing a callback to it for another function, such as with the .map, .reduce, and .filter functions that we covered in the array methods lesson, like this. So we can use the arrow syntax, the arrow function syntax, but instead of having to include the brackets and a return, what we're doing here is actually what's called an implicit return. So these are equivalent functions, right? These are both arrow functions that return the sum of the two parameters. But because there is no brackets here, the JavaScript in runtime is going to understand that we actually want to return this value, and we don't even have to specify. And today, yeah, we're just going to be going over a few minor points about how do objects work, how can we define objects, how can we reference properties and methods from objects, and what really is an object when we get down to it. So first of all, one of the most interesting things about objects in JavaScript is that almost everything in JavaScript is secretly an object. That even goes for functions. So the only difference between a function and an object is that a function is callable. So we can use the parentheses syntax, like so, with the parameters inside of the parentheses to actually call a function. But under the hood, most things in JavaScript are just really objects that have been dressed up with some fancy syntax. And yeah, so objects are this super powerful thing in JavaScript where we can have a collection of methods and properties. We can give them names and we can attach them under this single umbrella known as an object. So today what I want to do is just give a little demonstration. We've done the person example where we define a person as an object before. And I'm just going to do it quite simply so that you can see kind of how this works. So first of all, this is the basic syntax for the declaration of an object. We have the variable keyword and then the variable name, and then we are using the equal sign operator to set it equal to this sort of parentheses syntax, and then a list of comma separated key value pairs. So we have the key here, first name, and the value John, the key here, last name, and the value Doe, and then we have an ID. And so you can see A, we can use different data types for each field, and B, that yes, this is very similar to some sort of key value store that you might see in like a NoSQL database. And one of the most powerful things about objects is that we can actually include methods on them. So here I've included a method which will allow us to reassign a person's ID to a new ID. And you'll notice that this keyword, which we haven't really touched on, allows us to access our own property. And this keyword actually is usable in almost any scope within JavaScript. This keyword is defined as something. But here, this keyword refers to the object itself. So if we go ahead and console log, we can reference the properties by using a period. So if I go person.firstName, and then we go ahead and quickly run this, you'll see that indeed we're going to print out the first name property. And we can also do this in a different way. And this actually allows us to dynamically call object properties. So if I use this syntax, we can accomplish the same thing. As you can see, it's now printing twice. But since we have this string as the input, as the property name, we could define a string somewhere else. So I could actually go const property equals first name. And then instead of even typing it out, I can just do property. And we'll see that that still works. So that's great because it actually allows us to dynamically fill in what property we want to use in the object property syntax. And then just to give a little demonstration of how we would go about using the methods, all we have to do is do person.changeID. We do the normal syntax for calling a method or a function, and then I can set the ID. So we can go ahead and first of all, let's check with the person ID without. It's 1025 as we've defined up here. But then if we move that to after the call, we'll see that indeed we are able to change the ID using this method that we've attached to the object. So you can see that this is such a flexible concept where you can actually do so much with this. There are so many different ways that you can use this construct to sort of represent information, to really simply package together a bunch of relevant information. And this object syntax is the basis for actually creating schemas and databases in MongoDB, which is really beautiful because we get to have this same syntax, this same construct operating across all of our different platforms. We don't have to think about, when we're using MongoDB, we don't really have to think about how am I going to go about strictly schematizing this and turning it into an SQL query. We can really just slap this object almost straight into the database and it will parse it as we would expect. So yeah, I mean, that's the very basics of objects, and there's actually a lot more to learn in terms of prototypical inheritance. But that's sort of a deeper level concept that I feel is slightly beyond the scope. But I'd recommend you look into that if it sounds interesting to you. If you're familiar with object-oriented programming, that might sound somewhat familiar. And we teased a little bit last time what we'd be covering in this lesson. We have two primary ways to declare functions in JavaScript. We have the typical syntax that we're used to, which is something like this. We use the function keyword followed by the name of the function, then some expected parameters, and then just a curly brace syntax for delineating the actual code inside the function. And we also touched on that the fact that we could actually attach properties to functions because they are indeed objects under the hood. And in this case, I'm doing it just to demonstrate a little nuance in the way that arrow functions work. But typically, this isn't really something that we would do in the typical use case. And yeah, so this is the typical syntax for declaring a function. And we have the more compact syntax called the arrow function, which we touched on a bit last time. And I mentioned that there are some key differences in the way that they're executed. And today I want to pinpoint those differences because I think this can be quite a difficult topic for a beginner in JavaScript to understand because it feels like, okay, it's a function. They're both functions. What exactly could be different? And when you're debugging the code, it's not really evident, and the difference is quite subtle. And as you might have already guessed, the key difference comes down to this keyword. Arrow functions are inherently what is called anonymous, which means that they don't really have their own name and they don't really create their own scope. They are lexically resolved, which means that they're going to use the scope that they are in to figure out relative to what the references are being made. So let's make a little demonstration to make that a little more clear. So in JavaScript, we have a little utility function called setTimeout. It allows us to execute a callback after a specified amount of time. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a little function here that is going to be executed after 500 milliseconds using the setTimeout function. And I'm going to just have it log this value that we've attached to the what color is the sky function as a property. And then if we go ahead and execute this function, we'll see that there's actually a slight problem here. It's undefined. And this actually touches on what I was saying earlier. Because this callback inside of here has its own scope, this keyword is no longer actually attached to the parent function. So as I mentioned before, arrow functions are lexically resolved, meaning that they're going to use the context of their parent to determine, for example, this keyword. And if we just go ahead and actually transform this into an arrow function as so, we'll see that when we execute it this time, we have no problem resolving that property off of the parent function. And this is one of the key things that makes arrow functions so useful. They're sort of this anonymous, blockless way to define a function. So we can use a function without messing with the scope that it's being executed in. So we can create a function in here and still be using the same context as it would be if the code was running outside of a function, just inside here. So yeah, that is the primary difference between arrow functions and normal functions. And the arrow functions are especially useful in places where we are not going to be 100% sure of what the scope is going to be. And that might sound a little bit abstract at first, but you can imagine, for example, in the array methods lesson that we sort of outlined, for each, we're going to have a callback that's going to be executed several different times with different data. And this is actually a really good use case for arrow functions because we don't really want it to be defining a whole new scope every time that it loops through, iterates through another element in the array. So yeah, these are the kinds of situations in which we should apply arrow functions. And especially once you start using front-end frameworks that have a little more class-based structure, you'll find that this is a really useful tool. And really, the main thing that you should, the main tool that you should use to determine whether you should be using a normal function or an arrow function is just trial and error. At first, it won't be exactly obvious when a arrow function should be used, but if you're trying a normal function and you're having problems accessing the this keyword, odds are you're going to just want to use an arrow function in its place. So yeah, that's basically the gist of arrow functions in JavaScript. There are there's a little more depth to cover, and if you really are interested, you can look that up online. But I think that this is the basic amount of information you need to know to start using arrow functions in JavaScript. So thank you guys so much for watching another video. As always, I'm Gray Lewis. I have a great time teaching this course. If you have any questions or confusions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me on the Eduonix website. I will be replying there as quickly as I can. But yeah, thank you so much for watching, and have a great day. Bye.